I'm Mark Hanson, and I was perhaps am the oldest YSSP fellow, at least attending today. I was there in 1977. So, and I can say one thing after our last rousing presentation, and that is that I had a really good time at IIASA. So just a note that I was at IIASA in 1977. I did a postdoc in 1979. I was there a decade later for a retrospective conference, about 1988, when I was a faculty member at the University of Wisconsin. But I am very pleased to participate in some of that foundational work at IIASA that was led by Wesley Fell. And the work was very much in energy and environmental systems analysis at the time, a lot of applied policy, and it had a very international flavor. We spanned the Iron Curtain because in the 4 regions that we studied, Austria, and these were energy environmental futures we were looking at. It was Austria, it was the Rhone-Alpes region of France, it was the DDR, the German Democratic Republic, and in particularly the Leipzig region, which is notable for, at the time, the coal production, and looking ahead to what would happen with the fast breeder. And then Wisconsin was the 4th area. Today's presentations are on energy and its pathway to energy justice and energy sustainability. And what we'll hear today demonstrates how the work of IIASA has expanded since my early days to encompass climate change, which we were thinking about, but we didn't do anything on climate change then. Energy security, population dynamics and equity, and more of a holistic view of sustainability. One announcement I'd like to make this morning, and I've been given just a few minutes to do this, is that in support of this type of work in the continuing Wisconsin and IIASA collaboration, Wes and Anki Fell have made a generous donation to the Wisconsin Foundation and to the U.S. Friends of IIASA. And this grant, this donation, generous donation, is to establish a UW-Madison IIASA partnership. And so that is something that I'm very pleased to be able to just announce today. Some of you may have heard of it already. Wes Fell would have liked to have been here, but he could not make it in the schedule he's got going. He could not be here with us today. This is a seed grant, and it is already in use supporting travel between Wisconsin and IIASA, both directions. Greg Nemeth from the University of Wisconsin was at IIASA last week. We've got a person from IIASA, whose name now I don't have with me, that will be at Wisconsin this week. We're also supporting this travel money that's available through this grant is supporting one of our young scientists this summer. And that's Gisang Yanyi, who is, I believe she is Tibetan and studying at the University of Wisconsin. The purpose of this grant is to enhance the existing long-time collaboration between Wisconsin and IIASA, and it's to establish a long-term sustainable structure for continuing cutting-edge science, systems analysis, and international policy. And particular areas are in energy, climate change, and in environmental sustainability, especially in the air quality area. And with that note, I now want to turn to our panelists. Our first speaker this morning on the panel will be Ben Leibowicz, young scientist from 2013, faculty at the University of Texas at Austin, and he will be talking about my climate change mitigation research at IIASA, past and present. Ben.
Okay, so good morning, everyone. First, I just want to say thank you to Maggie and all of the other organizers for inviting me to speak at this event. When I heard it was IIASA's 50th anniversary, I said I definitely have to be there. So thanks for inviting me. So I'll just talk a little bit about my past experiences at IIASA, how they fit into my career development, both as a graduate student and now as a faculty member, and also give a brief summary of some research that I'm just going to start embarking on later this summer. Sort of the first time I'm formally collaborating with IIASA since I got to the University of Texas. So I thought I would start with just a timeline for some context and to show how IIASA has kind of aligned with my career here in the United States. So you can see that from 2011 to 2016, I did my PhD in management science and engineering at Stanford. And during that time, I had the really good fortune to spend 3 summers doing research at IIASA. So the first of those summers was in 2013 when I was in the YSSP. So I worked with Arnulf Grubler and Volker Cray in what used to be the Transitions to New Technologies and Energy programs at IIASA. And then I won the Peche Award, which came with 6 months of additional funding to go back to IIASA. And I had such a great time my first summer there that I looked at the schedule for my remaining years of my PhD. I saw there were 2 summers left. So I said, can I just come back for 3 months each of the next 2 summers? And that's what I did. Then on the coming slides, I'll just briefly talk about the research I did during those summers at IIASA as a student. Then since I became a faculty member at the University of Texas, I've gone back to visit IIASA twice for very short visits. So one of those, I was actually in Europe for some conferences and decided to stop by IIASA, give a seminar, say hi to old friends. And then in 2019, so a few months before the pandemic, there was this IIASA Right workshop on low energy demand scenarios for climate change mitigation. And that was really a great workshop I was able to attend. I was hoping to go back that summer to continue that work that was really inspired by the workshop. Unfortunately, COVID happened, but now I'll be able to go this summer thanks to a grant that I just got from the University of Texas Global Office. So I'll talk about that in the coming slides. So just briefly, some of the research I did as a student at IIASA. So during my YSSP summer, really I was tasked with bridging some of the insights that had been developed through the Transitions to New Technologies group through their analysis of historical technology diffusion processes, and how do we actually take all of that knowledge and embed it in the integrated assessment model message. So I was specifically interested in how do technologies sort of flow across space and time from the advanced countries where those technologies are sort of first enthusiastically developed and adopted, and then how do countries at different stages of their technological development become able to then adopt those technologies as well. Then when I came back for 2 more summers, my work shifted a bit to look at the role of markets and competition for renewable energy technologies, and how do we actually get models like Message to incorporate the dynamics associated with markets. So I was specifically got really interested in endogenous technological change and learning by doing. So this is actually a concept that IIASA has really popularized over the decades. And really with this paper in Energy and Economics, what we looked at is this gap between the way that models like Message were representing learning by doing at this very aggregate whole market sort of level. And we coupled Message to a more detailed model of firms who learn and bring their costs down and how they strategically compete with each other. And we were able to use this framework to show, for example, how the cost of climate policy can vary quite a bit depending on whether markets for these renewables are competitive or whether there's market power. Because if there's market power, then firms can actually capture a lot of the demand that's induced by climate policy. So then the last work that I conducted as a student at IIASA, and this ended up becoming part of my dissertation, was focused on really a broader, more general theoretical look at technology policy. So looking at subsidies for new technology development or consumer purchases of new technologies, and trying to figure out optimal portfolios of different policies to stimulate the deployment of new technologies. So because I spent these 3 summers at IIASA, some of this work became part of my dissertation at Stanford. Arnulf Grubler, who was one of my IIASA mentors in the YSSP, ended up being on my PhD committee. And from talking to people in the room this morning, it seems like that's actually a pretty common way that YSSP students continue to work with their IIASA collaborators. So then, like I mentioned, in 2019, I think this was November 2019, IIASA hosted this IIASA Right workshop on low energy demand, or modeling energy demand in general and understanding how low energy demand can contribute to climate change mitigation goals. This was really a terrific event. You could see sort of the theme of the workshop quoted there on the slide, basically just the idea that, you know, even though we're expanding renewable energy production quite a lot, you know, this is barely able to keep up with the expansion of global energy demand, especially from countries, you know, that still have a long way to go as far as energy demand sort of per capita. So really the idea of the workshop was, by reducing energy demand, or at the very least constraining its future growth, we'll be able to actually take that expansion of clean energy production to actually displace fossil fuel production, instead of merely just adding new energy sources on top of all of the old ones and not actually reducing emissions in the process. So I got really interested in this idea and, you know, was hoping again to continue it that summer, but now I'll finally get to work on this low energy demand stream of research. So let me just tell you about this new collaboration I have that's going to support a visit by one of my PhD students and me to IIASA later this summer. So we're very much looking forward to that. So at UT, we have an office called Texas Global, which is more or less our international office. So you could see here, actually, this image is taken from, they maintain a really detailed interactive database where you can see all of the connections and partnerships that UT has with universities and institutions around the world. So you could see with that box there, I've sort of zoomed in on Austria. So I think it shows, for example, that there's 8 Austrian students currently at UT and 8 UT students currently studying in Austria. You could see I'm one of those 33 faculty who has some kind of interest or collaboration going on in this country. The one partnership actually is between our business school and the WU University in Vienna, the Economics and Business University. So they do a good job actually maintaining data and facilitating these collaborations. So really what's going to support this new collaboration, they give these faculty research seed grants, which support faculty to go out and build partnerships and research collaborations with international institutions around the world. And this year, the call specifically highlighted work that's relevant to sustainable development goals. So I saw this call come through my inbox and I said, you know, that looks like a perfect opportunity to collaborate with IIASA again. So I was lucky enough to get one of these seed grants, and I'll be making a 2-week visit to IIASA in July with one of my PhD students, Rachel Moglin, and we'll be working together with my former IIASA mentor, Arnulf Grubler. So really the general idea of this project is aligned with that low energy demand workshop from 2019. And the basic idea of our project is looking at reductions in demand at the final consumer level and how those don't only necessarily bring about greenhouse gas emissions reduction at the level of the consumer, but they reduce emissions upstream in supply chain. So I'll give you one concrete example on the next slide. And really, we plan on approaching this problem from a very theoretical perspective. So focusing on relatively simple analytical models to illustrate all of the relevant effects that go into determining the ultimate effect on greenhouse gas emissions. So just as a concrete example, let's think about something like the trend toward work from home, or at least flexible work arrangements where some people are only going into an office 2 or 3 days a week. And, you know, at the consumer level, you can look at that and say that's going to reduce operational energy use and emissions in transportation because people are commuting less than they did before. But our hypothesis is that you can actually get pretty big greenhouse gas emissions reduction as you trace the effects of that change at the consumer level up supply chains. So for example, you might have lower energy use and emissions than in vehicle manufacturing, and then that could go all the way up to the raw materials level because you don't need as much steel, aluminum, and other materials for vehicles. But the story doesn't really end there, right? Because the ultimate impact on emissions also depends, for example, on how consumers reallocate their budget. So they're saving some money on commuting. What do they then spend that money on? And are those goods and services carbon intensive or not? And then we can look at, as you go up the supply chain, right? If we reduce demand for these items for transportation, then we're also going to, for example, lower the prices in markets for some of those inputs to production, and that could have ripple effects to other sectors of the economy. So just one concrete example of what we have in mind. So lastly, I know I'm at time. I just wanted to briefly highlight some of the unique advantages I see in working with IIASA, and I think they'll resonate a lot with folks in the room. So developing a broad and diverse global network, understanding the challenges faced by people from different countries and the way that people from around the world think about solutions differently than they think about them here in the US, for example. And of course, just the general setting of being at IIASA in Luxembourg, in Vienna, intellectually inspiring and also a good way to sort of step outside of the normal routines of academia. So I'll stop there and just once again say, thank you for the invitation to come be here today.
Thank you, Ben. We'll perhaps have time for a question or two at the end, but we're going to move on to our next two speakers. The next speaker is Narasimha Rao from the Yale School of Environment. He was an IIASA postdoc from in the period of 2011 to 2013. His presentation today is on deepening equity in IIASA's climate research. And this is one of those new themes that I did not see back in 1977 and 79.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm also really grateful to be invited to this event and see a lot of colleagues that I haven't seen in a long time. Unlike many of you, I actually did not attend the YSSP program, but I actually have a long history at IIASA. I wanted to start by just describing my personal journey. I built my academic career at IIASA, starting with my postdoc. In October last year, I completed 10 years of my association with IIASA, 7 years in Austria, and then 3 years that I've been at Yale. And over that period of time, I had a lot of interesting opportunities. While I was there, I was fortunate enough to receive a grant that allowed me to take a niche research interest and mainstream it into a research activity in the energy group. And that was very, very, very useful to me. What was important about my time there is that when I came to IIASA, there already was a strong interest in equity and poverty. There were several NMOs from the Global South that had joined well before. And so it was in fact a mission of the institution to try and build studies of equity into analyses at IIASA. And in the energy and climate space in particular, I'm pretty sure at the time that in the integrated assessment community more broadly, the message and the tools that were being developed that were formally trying to incorporate the ability to study equity and poverty were pretty much at the cutting edge or forefront of the models that were around. So that's what I want to talk about, is how has the representation of equity evolved over that time and where we can go in the future, and the work I've done as well to contribute to it. So the message integrated modeling framework is very complex and represents a lot of the linkages to other different natural systems that the energy system interacts with: land use, air pollution, water systems, climate change, of course. But I'm more interested in energy demand. So how do we represent the human activities that are driving the energy system and all of these environmental impacts? And usually we represent energy demand in terms of the sectoral components. So that's industry, transport, and buildings, which we drive from aggregate GDP growth. And that generally gives us a good understanding of overall aggregate movement in the energy system. But if we're interested in representing equity, that is, if you're trying to understand the distribution of the benefits and costs of environmental impacts and of policies, then we need to go beyond aggregate impacts and represent distributions. So the first step in that direction has been to at least look at income distributions within countries and how those evolve over time. And that was the first step. So the energy group has a specific sub-component of message called message access that represents household energy poverty and how with increasing consumption and income, people's appliances in their homes change. And these aren't well represented by average effects because you have things like urbanization in countries that influence very significantly for the same given income level, what kind of patterns of consumption you have. So it's important to really represent heterogeneity within countries. So with this representation, it opened up the possibility for many different kinds of analyses. So for example, like I said, we had a lot of representation of energy poverty and people moving up the energy ladder using different kinds of cook stoves, moving off of solid fuels, and seeing how they, with rising income, purchase different appliances and how that affects energy demand. But we also had the ability to look at the impacts of climate policies. So if we were to impose carbon taxes in developing countries that increase energy prices, we can look at the distributional impacts on people. For example, we had an interesting insight with cook stoves that people who use biomass and transition to liquid petroleum gas, LPG, much cleaner cook stove, when energy prices go up, they tend to fall back into using biomass and wood stoves. But if you transition to electric cook stoves, because you have much more substitutability with other forms of electricity production from renewables, the price impacts are actually less dramatic, and so it ends up being a more resilient transition fuel. But of course, developing countries are plagued with very unreliable electricity systems, so that's difficult to make that transition. The project I was mostly involved in and interested in was thinking about poverty more broadly beyond just income poverty and understanding the multiple dimensions that comprise poverty. And if we really want to understand how that impacts individual well-being and as well the resource needs that are generated by trying to fill gaps in those service deprivations, we need to think about energy demand in a way beyond just income distribution. And so I was involved a lot in trying to think about how can we derive energy demand directly from the services that people enjoy and linking that to poverty more directly. And so that involved generating a whole set of analytical tools to draw on industrial ecology so we could trace, as Ben was talking about, the footprints of different services in terms of their supply chain impacts on energy use. And so this kind of footprinting enabled us to develop an energy demand projection methodology that was different from the past. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. And once we had that, it occurred to me that when you have the ability to develop these energy footprints from services, you can also derive pollution footprints, air pollution footprints as well for households. And the air pollution group was already involved in looking at the air pollution impacts on households. And so we had the ability to combine and develop contributions of households to air pollution and compare it to the impacts of air pollution on households. And so we had a very interesting study where we collaborated to develop this view in India of how do households contribute to air pollution both directly and indirectly from the industry, from the industrial production that results from their consumption, and found that poor rural households in India end up bearing the impact of air pollution, not just from their own cook stoves, but also from the consumption of urban consumers. So going back to this idea of deriving energy demand from basic well-being, this was many years of work where we tried to build a bottom-up an understanding of, first of all, what poverty really is in terms of material deprivations. And so we actually have now a characterization for most of the world of deprivations in living standards, what we consider the basic material prerequisites for achieving a good life. And using these analytical tools I described in industrial ecology and building modeling, we now have a way to project energy demand, translate it into the sectors that we're used to modeling in our traditional IAMs, and developing that streamlined methodology. So now we can think about projecting energy demand in the future in terms of different development pathways, to what extent they represent poverty eradication, to what extent they represent just gains in affluence. So that's a direction that we're building even further. There's the other direction. We talked about feedbacks, which is you need to also represent distributions to understand the impacts of climate change on people. So we've done a lot of work thinking about where are they vulnerable populations to different kinds of climate impacts. So for example, we've looked at heat exposure at a fine spatial scale overlaid that with population distribution and how that will evolve into the future, and then thought about how income distribution will affect people's ability to acquire air conditioning or some mechanism to adapt to a heat exposure. And from that, we can identify hotspots around the world, which tend to be concentrated largely in absolute numbers in South Asia, China, and Indonesia. Of course, in terms of percentage of people, is spread all over sub-Saharan Africa as well. But the bulk of people who will be exposed and not be able to afford AC would be in those three regions. And ironically, those are the very three same regions that the International Energy Agency projects we will see at least half of the air conditioners that will be purchased by 2050. So this is a really story about inequality and unequal access to technology that is also part of the problem over here. I'm starting to do some analysis within the US as well. It's not just a problem of poor countries, but there are a lot of people within the United States who also not only not have an AC, but many AC users don't use the air conditioner because they can't afford to, or they want to use the money for food expenditure. So understanding where those vulnerabilities are, and then coordinating with, working with public health academics, we're trying to find out how air conditioning is helping to avoid heat-related mortality. So these are just examples of how representing distributions allows you to do much more fine-scale analyses of impacts of climate and climate policies. But I think we can go much further in the future, integrating even more with other disciplines. I think there's work to be done in integrating the social sciences, where we have a deeper understanding of consumption patterns and lifestyles. How is that going to evolve into the future? We have a rich literature, an empirical literature on well-being studies, so we can understand what are the private benefits of different consumption pathways and not just their resource impacts, and that's also important. And so I hope we can head in that direction to a greater extent. Thanks very much, and hope to discuss some of this a little later.
Thank you, Narasimha. Our final speaker in this session is Gurneeta Vasudeva Singh, young scientist, 2004, now with the University of Minnesota at the Carlson School of Management. Her next topic is of interest to me. My colleagues who are working with me on solar projects are all driving electric vehicles, and I'm at the edge of transition to electric vehicle. But her topic is navigating ecosystem bottlenecks for electric vehicle commercialization, taking a systems approach.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you very much for including me. I'm really delighted and honored to be here. So I'm going to provide a management perspective on innovation and technological solutions to climate change. And hopefully that complements the work of the two other panelists, Narasimha and Ben, in terms of providing a systems approach, extending the engineering and the environmental policy perspective on some of these challenges. So I'm a YSSPer from 2004, and I continue to be engaged with IIASA as a member of the US Committee for IIASA. I also had the opportunity to visit IIASA a few years ago for the 40th anniversary of the YSSP. And it's always a delight to go back and engage with that community again. So do I change the slides from here, or okay? So how does that work? Okay. So in the spring of 2004, just before I went to the YSSP program, I was reading this book called Complexity by Mitchell Waldrop. And the first chapter of that book actually introduces you to Brian Arthur and his work on increasing returns to scale. And I remember being very fascinated by the work that Brian Arthur had been doing in terms of this idea, and also the fact this excerpt actually mentions IIASA, references IIASA, because much of his thinking on this concept of increasing returns to scale, which has been very impactful in studies of technological innovation, were developed at IIASA while he was roaming the gardens in the Schloss, I believe. And a few months later, I, was at IIASA myself, and, part of the YSSP program. And lo and behold, who's my next door neighbor in the Transitions to New Technologies group? It's Brian Arthur. He was the visiting senior researcher that year. And I had, again, I was absolutely, dazzled. I was on top of the world. I gave him some of my drafts of the dissertation proposal that I had been working on, and I still have some of his marked up copies telling me to talk about what I believe in and what I think, rather than spewing references and citations. So that was, one lesson that he has given me, which has stayed with me since. So as you can see from those pictures, IIASA and the YSSP program were a lot of fun. And this echoes what Roger was saying earlier about the importance of this intercultural commingling that happens, and the fact that there is a lot of this informal interaction, which becomes the glue for the interdisciplinary work that is so crucial for systems analysis and the problems that IIASA and the community here is trying to address. The work that I did at IIASA and for my dissertation pertained to the emergence of new technologies. In particular, given my background in international development and environmental and energy security issues, I was interested in the role of fuel cell technologies, and I was looking at the emergence of fuel cell technologies in different countries, and I was taking the approach of understanding some of the management questions, looking at how companies and governments and nonprofit organizations were contributing to the emergence of a hydrogen economy. And so that work eventually did get some recognition. I received 2 dissertation awards from the Academy of Management and the Academy of International Business. And I think I owe a lot to this, intellectual capital and all the outcome here to some of the work that I had done at IIASA. Eventually, I was also successful in publishing some of the research that I initiated in my dissertation. Some of these papers that appeared in management journals looked at the role of alliances, networks, and portfolios of businesses in their technological innovation development, and how those alliances, networks, and portfolios impacted knowledge building, knowledge dissemination, and commercialization of new technologies. So the study that I'm currently pursuing is looking at the commercialization of electric vehicles, which is a continuation of some of the work that I did on fuel cells. Of course, only 1 or 2 companies have actually developed commercialized vehicles using hydrogen, based fuel cells. But we're seeing a much greater movement towards electrification of the transportation sector. And this is also a sector which is very much characterized by the problem of increasing returns to scale, which leads to technological lock-ins and makes it much harder to disrupt and move from the internal combustion engine, conventional energy technologies to the new electrification-based transportation sector. So this is kind of giving us a sense of the ecosystem for General Motors, which includes, of course, the demand side, the drivers, the complementers, and the other technologies like battery providers that are very crucial for the emergence of the electric vehicle ecosystem. So one of the key challenges in this space is the quintessential chicken and egg problem. So in these platform-based technologies, you're not going to get the demand side to come to the platform. You're not going to get enough users and consumers unless you have the complementers, the charging stations, the OEMs developing these technologies. And you're not going to have the complementers, the supply side, the OEMs coming to the platform until enough people who are willing to buy these cars and are able to overcome, the fears of their batteries getting discharged and, the other types of anxieties that often drive electric vehicle adoption. So the question that we are asking is how do we overcome these bottlenecks in terms of the supply side bottlenecks? And oftentimes the solutions to these bottleneck problems is discussed in the context of companies themselves endogenously addressing some of these issues related to complementary development, product markets, as well as overcoming some of the legacy technologies. Because a lot of times the companies, with the exception of few companies like Tesla, the ones that are developing electric vehicles also have a lot of investments in the legacy technologies, the internal combustion engines themselves. And so that becomes a bottleneck in moving towards the new clean technology. And so, what we are examining here is the impact of weather shocks. And this is where we, bring together some of the climate change, impacts with the adoption of new technology. And we're looking at how these extreme weather events might induce behavioral changes, because new technology adoption is as much a behavioral issue as it is a technological issue. And we're looking at how these weather shocks might then lead to more consumption, more adoption from a pro-social perspective, and in that sense, how that demand might then lead to more firms entering these new markets where demand is happening, as well as more complementers stepping in and thereby helping in the development of a robust platform ecosystem. So we develop a path model for the emergence of this platform ecosystem for electric vehicles. I'm not going to go into too many details here, but I'll just highlight some of the main findings, which is to say that we do find evidence for a significant effect of extreme heat events, not so much extreme cold weather events, but more in terms of heat events, leading to the adoption of electric vehicles. And that firm entry does respond to this kind of pro-social demand. Firms do enter markets where they see demand in response to these extreme weather events, despite the constraints or bottlenecks on complements. So even in the absence of complements, when there is demand in response to these weather shocks, we're seeing businesses enter. And then, we see some other effects in terms of how a more robust complementary ecosystem starts to develop. And we also find effects which support the idea that legacy commitments by these companies might, in fact, preclude their further investments. So that slows down the advancement towards electric vehicle transition. So I'll stop here, and I wanted to kind of give you a flavor of the research that I'm doing and how it is very much imprinted by my experiences at IIASA and some of the conversations that I had back then with Brian Arthur, with Naki, with Arnulf, and so many other fellow YSS peers. And it's very much, I think, again, building on this idea of increasing returns to scale, which is, again, something that I associate with the work of Brian Arthur. So again, I think the YSSP program and IIASA have been very influential and continue to shape some of the research that I'm doing, even almost 20 years since. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gurneeta. Maggie, do we have a few minutes for questions, or how are we on the schedule? We'll take 2 questions. All right. Any questions? Please.
Those are my slides.
Was there a question in the back? Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. Oh, it's a person with a microphone. Okay.
Actually, let me ask you, Mark, a question, if I may, since you started. So 77, as we learned, was the first year of YSSP. So how did you know about it? How did you get recruited to go if it was just starting? What's your background to get into it?
Sure. I was, so I believe I may have been in the second year. There may have been a YSSP in 1976. But I had been asked, I was a grad student at University of Wisconsin-Madison, and the research group, Energy and Environmental Systems in the 4 regions was going, but they lacked 2 things in the group at the time. And one is they had no one that was modeling the transportation sector. And at that time, I was working on a energy environmental model of transportation energy use. And so I had that. And they also realized that in the group that one of the bridges, especially to the German Democratic Republic, was to be driving the futures, the analyses, the economic drivers with using input-output models. And no one else in the group had some background in input-output economics, which has emerged out of work in the Soviet Union, adapted in the United States, but not that widely adapted. And I happen to have some background in that. And so as a graduate student, I got pulled into a couple of the early work sessions pre-YSSP at IIASA, and then asked to come back for the YSSP program. But it was sort of having a skill set at the right time, at the right location. Yeah. Well, good. Well, thank you. And we will move on to the next session.